Welcome, everybody, to a very special episode of Pop Goes the Zebra. This is it. This is the big one that we've been talking about since the dawn of episode creation. We're going to be talking about Titanic. But before we do, of course, the introductions. I am Jeremy the Ref, alongside my trusty sidekick, Jesse the Ref. Jesse, are you excited about this one?
Yeah, this has been an interesting one between doing the Apollo 13 and this one. Those are the two that we've been, I think, pretty much chomping at the bit to do.
We're gonna do things a little differently on this one. For those of you that have already seen it, we did the watch along of Apollo 13, and we really enjoy doing it that way. For this one, however, we are not going to go the watch along route. Personally, I have no issue overall with the James Cameron film that probably makes Titanic its most famous in pop culture. The problem is there is just not enough time in our lives to sit there and watch a 3 hour movie and do the
Oh
talk
my
along.
God. It was
Plus,
what, 3.5 hours?
and plus a lot of it has to do with the Romeo and Juliet story, which I am not pooping on. It's just we're talking about actual facts of Titanic. And while the Cameron movie is excellent and very worthy of all the awards it's gotten and the praise it gets, two entirely separate stories here. We're talking about Titanic versus a Hollywood narrative, and we're not doing Hollywood narrative this time. We did that for Apollo 13 because it was the easiest way to stick along with everything, and it kind of gave us a guideline. But with Titanic, we're pretty blessed with having this is a more famous story. Most people know the general story of Titanic, save for some key details that only nerds like Jesse and I would care to even look up. So that's more or less what we're going to do. So if you're looking for the watch along, I'm not saying we're never going to do it, but we're probably never going to do it. But anyways, Jesse, any thoughts before we get into this fully?
Now you and I have both taken a little bit of time the last couple of weeks whenever we've had a chance to really research this. And it's kind of amazing the wealth of knowledge that's out there now versus when we when at least when I got into caring about Titanic, because there's just all I had was books. I didn't have documentaries on YouTube. I didn't have James Cameron's in-depth stuff. So like it's very fascinating just the last couple of weeks to learn new things about something I knew a lot about, but then I just found some completely mind-blowing things about it that yeah, I can't wait for us to talk about.
And I don't know exactly how to start this other than to I'm going to start in 1898 with something that is not necessarily Titanic related, but in terms of the story, it almost feels like the right place to go because of what would become of events later. But in 1898, there was a book called Futility, and it was a book about a British liner named Titan that on her maiden voyage in April strikes an iceberg in the North Atlantic, and it resulted in the loss of passengers and crew. Now, there would be some revision to this book in the aftermath years later of the actual sinking of the Titanic, but the original book in its form was very eerily similar, very strikingly similar to what would actually become of the real life ship named the Titanic. Uh, the Titanic really became an idea. 1907 is what I'm reading here. The White Star Line, the company that kind of would had the monopoly. Well, not the monopoly, but they were the big players in the modern forms of transatlantic travel and things like that. The man in charge, J. Bruce Ismay, he was the president of the company, along with others, came up with the idea to create a luxury ship. In fact, they created a few of them. And the idea was it was going to be just this gigantic luxury ship that in and of itself was almost a life a lifeboat in itself. It would be practically unsinkable. And what they came up with was the Titanic and its two sister ships, the Olympic and the Britannic. They had this idea that if you built it a certain way and had certain implementations in place, the ship was unsinkable. But if you go back and look, they stopped short of saying it was unsinkable. It said it was virtually unsinkable. Virtually
Yeah.
unsinkable. Even then, they were kind of manipulating the verbiage, but I just always find it interesting that you always hear it's the unsinkable Titanic. It's unsinkable. It's unsinkable. Well, if you go back and look, she was virtually unsinkable, and we find out, of course, she was sinkable, and we will get into why. Jesse, your thoughts early on.
Um, yeah, talking about that book, I was made aware of that when I was younger, and
I
even as
want
a
to get my
kid,
hands on it. I
I
have
would
not
love
yet.
to find an original copy. Um, just absolutely eerie that, down to particular details about it being in April, that it hits an iceberg in the North Atlantic on its maiden voyage. It is too freaky of a coincidence. Um, the thing, like I said, the big thing at the time in the early 1900s, ship travel was the big thing. Airliners and aircraft were not a thing yet. So
Yeah.
you basically had the White Star Line and Cunard, who had the Mauritania, the Lusitania, those type of vessels. So it was basically a back and forth war on who could build the bigger and more luxurious ship. Olympic being the first one built was kind of the standard. That was the flag bearer for White Star Line. And Titanic was supposed to be even more grandiose than the Olympic.
In July of 1908, they agreed on the plans for Titanic and the Olympic, and some 6 months later, they would lay down the keel for the Olympic, and then the following March, the Titanic. Um, this was a huge undertaking. They had thousands of workers working on this, and there's all sorts of urban legends and myths that they were in such a rush. I remember one as a kid. They were in such a rush to get the thing built that they actually sealed. I believe. See, have you heard this one that they actually sealed a worker inside the inside the Titanic in the hull, and I never did. I never did shy away from that one. That always kind of I don't know that actually would have happened.
No, I believe that was just kind of an urban legend saying that,
Yeah.
because there was a lot of myth behind why things were the way they were. Like, yes, they were on a time crunch, but we know that regardless of a time crunch, things are going to happen. And while they were rushing to meet the timetable, I don't feel as though those kind of things would have been crossed. Now, were there cost cutting measures?
Oh
I
yeah.
believe so.
Oh yeah.
100%.
We know there were cost cutting measures, and we'll get into that later. Um, the the thing I kind of want to talk about here in its construction, though, is going to be one of the key points that will come back to haunt the Titanic later. And there will be several in this, but I want to touch on this one now and plant the seed early. The Titanic, what made her unsinkable was she had a series of watertight bulkheads throughout, going from front to back of the ship. These acted as watertight compartments where you could seal it off, and water could not flood the rest of the ship or cause any further harm to the ship. And she was designed to withstand flooding in 4 compartments. Think of these as everybody has one of these in their freezer, at least that I know of. Go to your freezer, pull out your ice cube tray, and think of that in terms of inside the ship, and the walls on each section was a watertight compartment. Use that visualization in your head for later on. Now, why these are important right now is that during the building process, Mr. Ismay, the president of White Star, decided that he wanted to lower the ceiling of the bulkheads some 10 feet. This would be one of the first crucial mistakes, which they had no way of knowing it at this point in time. They didn't know it until later on. But this would be one of the reasons why Titanic ended up not being unsinkable, or at least why there were so many losses. There was so much loss of life that night, because they lost 10 feet either in that height. That was just quicker for the water to spill over into each compartment, and you will see that if you go back, that is precisely what happened. I'm wanting to say that it was lowered because they wanted to make some modifications on the grand staircase. I could be wrong on that, but I
I
believe that's what
I
I have.
believe that that's the commonly accepted consensus, was
Yeah,
that the grand staircase was to be a little bit more
grand.
luxurious, so they wanted it to go lower decks, and I believe they stop at E deck, and
Mm-hmm.
that is where the tops of the watertight bulkheads end. E deck is actually, I think, 20 feet above the water line, which is fine if the ship is sailing, but if the ship is taking on water, well, that 20 feet is gonna,
That 20
you've got
feet adds up
nothing to
quick.
stop that, you've got nothing to stop that water coming over. So
And we're throwing and this is always fascinating. We're throwing these numbers around. 20 feet. It's got a height of 200 feet. It's over 8. It's almost 900 feet long. That we don't have a lot of everyday reference to that we're walking around outside to see that. But this ship, she was massive. She was massive. And what blows me away even more is that we have ships. And I'm sure you've seen this picture. They take the Titanic and they put it up in front of modern day cruise liners, and
yep,
it dwarfs the Titanic.
you you could line
And
three Titanics about astern, and it would be the length of some modern cruise liners.
it was huge. It was very much worthy of the name Titanic because it was massive. But to counterpoint that, while all this is happening off the coast of Greenland, you got a gigantic piece of ice that's breaking off and falling into the ocean and starting its journey south some 2 years before it's meeting with the Titanic somewhere in the middle of the North Atlantic. It's amazing to me, all as you go back and you look at this story and all the key points in it, the amount of things that had to happen in just the right order, at just the right time, in just the right way for this piece of ice. And I say that, and it sounds like I'm minimizing it, but for all the ocean is massive. The Atlantic Ocean is massive. The Titanic is big for its time, but when you really step back and look at it, you're talking about two pinpoints meeting each other at happenstance in just the right way at just the right time. It is amazing just how unlucky the timing was. But generally speaking, there's been some back and forth on the size of this iceberg. A lot of people agree that this thing was almost 500,000 tons in mass. This thing was huge. I forget how many. I'm wanting to say it was like a few, like 100 feet up out of the water even. But
There there is a picture, and I'm searching through my reference
she
book.
was big enough that it was eclipsing and towering over the top deck of the ship. I do know that
Uh,
she was
um,
big.
Apparently, there was a photo taken from the Carpathia of what was presumed to be the iceberg, because there was markings of red and black on the side of it. So there is a picture out there of the alleged iceberg that Titanic hit, and it is in, we're talking 5, 6 stories
Yeah,
just sticking up out of the water. That's not accounting for the amount that's below the water.
and I think this is probably the best time to bring up what we were talking about earlier. Generally, it is common fact that the causing of the sinking of the Titanic was due to damage to the rivets and the connection at the plates for the steel squares that would create the hull of the Titanic. When they made the rivets, they buckled, and it was like a split seam. And some of you that have a swimming pool, you'd understand that. This, you got that seam right there in the liner, and it just opens up a little bit, and but it sideswipes the Titanic. The Titanic tries to do a port round maneuver, and it sideswipes the Titanic. We're going to use my remote control here as the Titanic going along the side of it. But I have always maintained, and it doesn't really matter whether it's true or not, I admit, we always hear that you only see the tip of the iceberg. It's the common phrase. It's the tip of the iceberg, where most of the mass of the iceberg is actually underwater, and it could stretch out hundreds of yards even. And I've always maintained that while the cause of the sinking was absolutely the buckling of the seams, that there was damage potentially done to even the bottom of the Titanic, the keel. But we'll never know, because we can't get underneath the Titanic due to its position at the bottom of the Atlantic Ocean. And we're not going to get inside to find out either. But I've always maintained that it's very possible that while it's sticking out up here and it's hitting, it's maybe, grinding on something underneath that we may not be able to see. But I'm no oceanographer expert. I just think that it's very possible that more damage was done to the Titanic than, we may have believed.
Yeah.
So the Titanic has started its construction in March of 1909. It takes her
it was like 2 years to be built.
Yeah, it was 3 actually. It was completed in March of 1912, after 10 months after the launch of her hull. During that time, and this is another factoid that I found pretty interesting, the Olympic, her sister ship, she's out on her maiden voyage. That's June of 1911. Who was the captain on that ship, Jesse?
That would in fact be Captain Edward J. Smith.
So Edward J. Smith is the captain of the Olympic, and he collides with the Royal Navy cruiser Hawk, and it causes a lot of damage to the Olympic. And I just find that fascinating. You've got a captain, and everybody, and historians, they all love Edward Smith. He was renowned in his day. He was like a rock star as far as sea captains go. I believe that you would even find that a lot of your noteworthy people of the day, when they were traveling, would make sure that they were traveling on a ship that Edward Smith was the captain of. And that was how well respected he was. Now, that being said, he is the captain of this gigantic flagship of a vessel, and he crashes it and damages it badly. And he actually, and through these actions, the Titanic's construction gets delayed.
It was
because
the collision with the HMS Hawk.
Yeah, it delayed the construction of the Titanic because they had to take materials and manpower from, the construction of Titanic and move that over to repairing the Olympic, because, there's a lot of money in these ships, not only in maintaining them, but obviously the income from the making the trips and transporting the passengers and so on and so forth. So what I'm saying is that Smith has just cost his company a lot of money. So what do they do when it comes time for the Titanic to sail? They make him the captain of the bigger ship, the more famous ship. And I've always found that fascinating. Jesse, do you have any insight into why they would have done that? Or
Um, a lot of things went into it. He was, I believe, the most seasoned captain of White Star Line. He was the most experienced, and despite the fact that he had had the incident with the HMS Hawk, which was partially due to error between communication between the stern and the bow of the ship, involving the Hawk, Smith was cleared of any wrongdoing. But they felt as though for the voyage of Titanic, which was to be his last,
yep, he
that
was going to retire.
that's the old cliche. It's my last round before retirement.
Oh, it was his
Uh,
last round.
um, they wanted somebody who is the most experienced and the most recognizable from White Star Line to be in command of the most luxurious ship of the time. So it made more sense to have Smith. He was very well liked, very well respected by all the officers. I believe a lot of the officers from the Olympics maiden voyage came over for Titanic.
In fact, they did. He had to reshuffle his crew, and that actually led to another issue. Um, Give me just a second to pull up the proper name, but while
I
I
do know.
look,
I think I do know where you're going with this.
it was
Uh,
the
I'll
officer that left the ship had the keys to the locker that had the binoculars for the lookout. And due to him leaving, he got off the ship in a hurry, as the story is told, because they brought over, and Jesse, I'm going to need you to help me a little bit with this because I don't have the information. But what happened was two of the Titanic's officers were actually demoted, so the officer coming over from the Olympic would actually be the officer in charge.
I believe so. That's one that it doesn't click entirely as to which officer it was. I don't remember if it was Moody or if it was Murdoch, but I believe it was one of the higher ranking officers from the Olympic uh,
Yeah,
coming over.
it was the
Cause
it was the officer just under the actual captain. And
first
I
officer, so it would have been
yeah,
Will. It would have been Will Murdoch.
well, Murdoch and Lighthauler were the ones that got demoted. And so that would have to
Oh
be,
yeah, you're right. It's like I said, the things with Olympic are fuzzy to me because I never studied a whole lot about Olympic.
yeah. And that's another topic for discussion later, but I've always found it fascinating how these key these key figures, and I'm thinking specifically of the Carpathia, um, in particular, go she they kind of fade into obscurity after their big moment. You know, the Carpathia is the one that saves everybody, but then you don't really talk about it. But hey, by the way, it had its own interesting career, but
Post Titanic,
post
yes.
Titanic, and that's a fascinating story too. I'm trying desperately to find this, and I can't believe you know who had the key. And but you're just ugh, give me just a moment. I'm actually going to pause this because I don't want this pregnant pause. So give me just a minute here.
The magic
We're
of
not gonna do it. Just give me just a second here. All right, so we got it. So what happened was when Smith came over, he actually brought a friend, but he brought over Henry Wild to be the chief mate, and in doing that, it actually bumped Murdoch, first officer, chief mate Murdoch, and first officer Lighthauler down to the ranks of first and second officer, and Wild became the chief mate. And the original second officer, David Blair, was bumped, and he had the key. He had the key to the locker, and I don't know that. having the binoculars, because of the conditions that night, you have no moon, it's a still sea, so you really can't see the waves breaking at the bottom of the iceberg.
You
I
see,
don't
that's
I
that
don't
that
know that the binoculars are going to necessarily make a huge difference,
I think
but I'm
with
also not an experienced seaman, so I don't know what they can see up there in that crow's nest on that night.
I honestly, I see, I'm of that opinion that 10 to 15 seconds more would have made a difference. If they had seen the iceberg just even 10 seconds sooner, the ship would
Because,
have probably been able to clear the iceberg with the port round.
but again, that goes back to, we don't know how big that iceberg was underneath the water, though,
This is
either.
true.
We don't know, we don't exactly know exactly where it hit, when it hit. Was it right up on top of what we see on the berg, or did they just assume they were up on top? But really, you know, the iceberg is here, but it's sticking out like this. You know,
There could
you
be a
think they're
lip that
hitting here,
catches the
but they're,
keel.
yeah, they could have done a number of things, which the keel is a double bottom keel, so I don't know necessarily that, I'm shooting holes in my own theory. I don't know that necessarily would have been enough to necessarily do enough damage that the Titanic would sink, but again, we don't necessarily know the full forensics of this. We have a general idea of what happened, but
There was
you'll never
another.
have a 100% clear picture of exactly what happened that night.
Yeah,
So unfortunately, when you tell the story of Titanic, there's no way of completely avoiding speculation.
yeah. And there was another theory saying that, if the ship had just hit the iceberg head on, the damage could have not been
As
as
severe,
severe.
but you still would have killed people.
Absolutely.
I generally do believe that exact theory. Um, they'd have had a hell of a time in the press about it, but overall, I think that she definitely would have stayed afloat. But again, hindsight is 2020. You just don't really know exactly how you would respond in that situation. I tend to give credence in the that you have a split second to figure out, are you going left, you going right, you going straight. uh I give credence to the officers in charge. If they felt that trying to port round was the best option, I am not going to second guess them, because I've never captained a boat on a pond, let alone a huge ocean liner uh full of passengers. I am not going to condemn them for trying to port round it, because, like I said, I wasn't there. I wasn't in that position. I probably would have just froze altogether, which is why they don't put me in charge of a boat. But yeah, it's just one of those things where you just never really know until you know. But I
Yeah.
think overall, she probably would have made it if she'd have hit it head on. It would have done a hell of a lot of damage to it, though, for
Uh,
sure.
Well, if you think about it, because the way the ship's bow is shaped, it's almost kind of like an axe, that there's the potential that the damage could have been very, very minimal in striking the berg. It could have potentially split into it, or it could have gotten
Now,
stuck,
and
you know?
I hate to do this, but we kind of have to pause this talk and move on, because
Oh yeah,
we're
we definitely move on.
we definitely jumped the shark. We'll get there. We'll get there. But anyways, she's completed. They use some materials on her and make some changes on her that definitely would come into play. They used rivets that contained some slag, which actually weakened the rivets. That would be another thing that would come into play. We talked about those seams earlier. It wasn't that they used bad material; they used good material. It's just they didn't use the best in all places. Again, they cut some corners. They sped up the process a little bit, because look, interest on this ship was huge. This was like the World Cup and the Super Bowl happening at once. Um, this was the talk of the day. Anybody who was anybody was going to be on this ship. The owners of JP Morgan were on this ship. Thousands upon thousands of people would be on there, not just first class passengers, but also thousands of immigrants that were trying to make a new life in America. um it's so sad when you go in and you look at these stories of the people that were on this ship and what they were trying to do on the other side of the ocean. That's really the tragedy here of the story. It's not that a boat sank. That's an immaterial, but human life was lost, and some of these people were just trying to better themselves. They were trying to seek a new fortune across the sea and provide a better life for their families. Some just wanted to say they were there and smoke cigars up in the smoking lounge. They're all people, and they all perished. Well, not all of them, but people from every class on that ship met their fate that night, and every one of them were a human being. um the official date for the maiden voyage is given as April 10th, and it was originally intended to be March 20, but that got delayed, as I said, because of the Olympics. So they create her, they take her out, they do their trials at the sea, and then on April 2nd, she sets sail from Belfast to Southampton with about 100,000 people watching, and they played Rule Britannia as
Yep.
she took off. And on the 3rd of April, she arrives in Southampton, where she gets some passengers and some crew, and then at noon on April 10th, she takes off from Southampton to New York. Um, Generally speaking, from all accounts, life on Titanic was lavish if you had the right ticket. Uh, Third class, I'm not going to say that it was, you know, inhumane conditions, but you definitely knew, you would know the difference walking in between the two sections, first class and third class.
You get
Um,
what you pay for,
well,
or what you can afford.
you get what, yeah, I like that better, actually. It's just amazing the amount of people that were on there, and the different walks of life that they came from. Jesse, talk to me about some of the fascinating things that have fascinated you about what was on the Titanic, because there are some things that come to mind with me, for me, when I think about it. The age-old joke is, "Hey, did you know that the swimming pool in the Titanic still has water in it?" They had a swimming
Yeah.
pool on a boat on the
It
Titanic.
wasn't just a swimming
Yeah.
pool, it was a heated swimming pool. Uh, yeah, the Titanic, just like Olympic, they had just state of the art luxuries for the upper class. The Turkish baths tend to be one of the more recognizable things from Titanic because they were not something that was, I believe, on Olympic. So the Turkish baths were a new feature to the Titanic. A
Wow.
squash court with gymnasium, so that way you could exercise while you're out at sea. Uh, I believe there's one barber shop, so you could get a fresh haircut and a fresh shave um, while commuting. Um, the food, something my girlfriend and I are both very fascinated in. We found a recipe book that had all of the recipes for some of the meals on Titanic, and just to look at beef Wellington served with asparagus tips and freshly roasted potatoes and things like that. Things that we can get in modern day for ourselves, but this was the top of the line food for first class passengers. The library, the smoking room, it was a hotel on the sea. It was a city almost, with shops and stores to buy things to make your commute a lot easier. And you have to think about all of the mail that was being transported.
Oh yeah,
The
there's a lot
RMS
of
is
mail.
because RMS stands for Royal Mail Ship.
Mm-hmm.
It was carrying cargo. It was carrying, I believe, some of the first automobiles coming from England to the United States. Um, so it was a Swiss Army knife of ships. Um,
She had a length of 882 feet 9 inches. That's roughly 3 football fields in length, roughly.
Roundabout.
American football fields,
Yes.
3 of them.
The length of two Saturn V's laying side by side.
And she had to have probably one of the most interesting factoids I can find is the price of a ticket to be on the Titanic. We're gonna break it down for you in today's approximate their price versus what that would be versus today's price.
Adjusted
So
for inflation.
yes, so back in 1912, for third class, you paid somewhere between 3 to 8 pounds, which would translate to $15 to $40 American, which translated today, I don't have the poundage, but in American dollars, they paid $350 to $900.
Which would roughly be just about 310 pounds to 800 pounds.
For a berth in a second class cabin, 12 to 60 12 pounds, which would round up to about $60 American, which for today's standards, $1,375. For a first class cabin, 30 pounds or 150 American dollars, which translates into $3,500. Now, for a
For the
first
staterooms.
class parlor suite, this is where it gets obnoxious. 870 pounds or $4,350, translated 100 grand.
Yeah.
100 grand for
Roughly.
a suite, roughly.
And this is
Roughly.
with hot and cold running water, with a fireplace, the most luxurious carpeting, the most beautiful wood paneling, the just everything that you could think, the lap of luxury in 1900s, you were paying for it to have in that stateroom or parlor room.
We weren't kidding when we said they wanted luxury on this thing. They wanted to leave zero doubt that if you were on the Titanic, you were somebody. You were amongst the elite of the day.
You would probably go to the smoking room and light your cigars with money.
Yeah. Yeah. So we will touch back on it again later, but now's probably a good time to sow the seeds, Jesse, for one of your theories that you believe we're gonna bump heads on. She sets sail for from Southampton to New York. What happens?
Just before that, somewhere in the transit between Belfast and Southampton, there is a fire in the coal bunker. Coal bunker 5,
Fire.
which is on the starboard side where the iceberg collision happens. Coal bunker 5 is towards the front of the ship, close to where the first funnel is, which is in the danger zone of where the iceberg struck. Coal fires were not uncommon in large ships at that time. Typically, what they would do is they would just let it burn, but what they would do was they would shovel the hot coals out of the bunker into the engine. But by doing this, it would increase the speed.
Yep. In
An,
fact,
an unknowing side effect was that the ship would be a little bit faster.
I was and also it would give it a little bit of a list. I'm wanting to say it was like 2 or 3 degrees.
2 to 3 degrees. You are correct.
If you were looking at a normal ship, would be perfectly balanced like that, right?
Yeah.
She would sit kind of, and you can go back and actually look at pictures. Pull it up on your Google. You can look at, if you see the Titanic head on as it's sailing, she's not completely level. she has a slight, ever so slight, but it is noticeable, a slight lean to her starboard side.
Yep.
Which, yeah, that is due to them shifting the coal from one side of the ship to the other to help start to put out the fire.
Unfortunately, the fire remained raging for several days before they even embarked.
And
So, so
not a lot of the passengers didn't even know about it. That was the best part.
no, none of the passengers knew
Nobody.
about it.
Oh, okay.
No,
You know.
and you have to remember they are the boilers that are being used are coal fired. That's what's
Mm-hmm.
powering the ship. All this steam and heat. Well, you've got a fire raging in a coal bunker where the separation between the coal bunker and the bulkhead is none. The coal fire itself is directly onto the bulkhead, which is now getting ready to go into very cold water. So you're
Mm-hmm.
going to have two opposite ends of the spectrum with steel that's maybe about 2 inches thick. You
Which, in
know,
and of itself, that's nothing to scoff at. There's a lot of strength in that. However, as we'll find out, you don't have to be a math genius to realize that a ship that weighs roughly, let me pull it up, about 46,000 tons, if
roundabout.
roundabout. She's going to strike something upwards of half a billion tons, or half a
The
million.
irresistible force
Yeah,
hitting an
there's a lot of weight.
immovable
Now,
object.
she's moving at, and this is always, I will find myself doing this sometimes. If you find yourself in the luxury of living country life like I do, go out to a country road that's not very well traveled. And if you got cruise control, it makes it even easier. Set your car to 26 miles an hour. That is the actual speed, land speed, that the Titanic would be moving on the night that it hit the iceberg. That comes out to 23 knots, a little over 26 miles an hour. To the naked eye, that's not a lot of speed. That's almost, you can almost run that fast, almost, if you're an Olympian. It's about twice the speed of a human being, I believe, that
Yeah.
the average human can run, maybe a little more. But you add on about 46,000 tons. That's not a lot of the brake time on that. And now you're adding water to the mix. Just think about how long it takes for a train to come to a stop. A train can take upwards of a mile to stop. Similar concept here. A boat that big in the middle of an ocean with a lot of forward momentum, it's going to take a while for that thing to slow down, let alone stop. And they didn't, and I'm getting ahead of ourselves again, but keep in mind, 26 miles an hour that's a fun little, you can do that yourself, and you can use the telephone poles at the side of the road. 6 to 10, depending on depending on the distance between the telephone poles. 6 to 10 is about all the length they had, the time they had to slow down and stop or move. And you're talking about, you're pretty much sailing a skyscraper, and that thing's got to turn. But anyway, so we're gonna jump ahead a little bit and get to the juicy parts. I'm gonna jump ahead to 14 April 1912, because generally speaking, they lived luxury for a few days. But I will comment.
Nothing interesting happens.
Well, they start getting warnings, and just your nothing dire, but ships ahead of them, because the Titanic had an outstanding Marconi system. It could talk for, I'm wanting to say, somewhere around 600 miles. Any ship in that radius. And they would get the occasional, saw some ice at this latitude and longitude. Just no more than how's your day? Oh, I saw a dog in the street. Something to that effect. It wasn't anything dire to them. But You fast forward to April 14, and the senior wireless operator, Jack Phillips, starts to receive messages of icebergs from other vessels further west out ahead of them. The first warning came from the Carolina, which spotted icebergs and growlers, which are small icebergs that really don't stick up out of the water much, which is actually what they were mostly afraid of that night. They weren't necessarily afraid of the big icebergs like the one that would sink the Titanic. They were worried about the stuff, about the size of a car that could do damage to a ship just as well as your larger icebergs. But the problem with the growlers is you can't see them because they're so small, and a lot of them are underwater that you can't see them anyways. They're just not visible to the naked eye as a 5-story iceberg. But they're getting warnings about those in the area around a day's sailing time away from the Titanic. And Captain Smith, he accepts the warnings and takes note of them, but really doesn't do anything about it until much later. He'd get a couple more throughout the day, but it wasn't until 5:30, or not 5:30. I'm sorry, I thought I had my computer sets right. It was about a little before 6 o'clock, about 10 minutes. They start to maneuver the ship, and this is ironic. They turn the ship south to get out of the line of fire. So they figure that if they can take the Titanic into the Gulf Stream, there wouldn't be any icebergs. And normally this is true, but in 1912, it wasn't a normal year for ice. Cold water had pushed the Gulf Stream further south, and the iceberg that would strike the Titanic was kind of insulated from any warm water, so it wasn't breaking down like it normally would. And a normal iceberg breaks down in about 2 weeks, in the warm water, and just depending on how much the water's lapping up on it, et cetera, sciencey stuff. But they did this turn that would actually bring the Titanic on a collision course with the iceberg. And that's just so heartbreaking to me because, they're doing everything by the book in 1912 standards. They don't realize that they just doomed themselves because they're heading right for disaster. That's just always fascinated me that, they make this last second move that isn't widely known in pop culture, but they turn her and they travel south for probably about 20 minutes or so. And, it's just baffling to me the chain of events that would go into play to sink the Titanic. And this is probably one of the ones that sticks out the most to me, is that the Titanic turned itself right into a collision course because nobody, is thinking that there's an iceberg, that far south.
Well, you're also at a time and point where radar doesn't even exist yet.
That's another thing. We tend to look at a lot of things in history and apply modern solutions to them, but we're ignorant to, well, I don't want to use the word ignorant. That sounds harsh. We forget that some of the technology we have is very new, especially when you're talking about Atlantic sailing. They was very much an old boys club. They stuck to the traditions. They stuck to a lot of the old ways of doing things, and it took a lot to change up a lot of stuff drastically. And the Titanic would serve as one of those instances where things were kind of dragged along in terms of evolution, but they didn't have radar. Another one that I love is, well, why didn't they have headlights? Well, first things first, cars were barely invented at this point, let alone headlights on cars. So those aren't widely in circulation. Now you're talking about taking a headlight strong enough to project out, I would say a good amount, about 500 yards at least, to see ahead of you. Those don't exist, and what they did have was very expensive and very hard to manage. So, it just wasn't plausible even if they had it. And
Even battleships at that point didn't even have those.
yeah, so you're talking about a commercial vessel here. The Titanic's not going to have headlights, and I don't think that even the headlights would have been enough, because they say you're only going to get maybe a couple hundred yards at best. They didn't see the Titanic until, or the Titanic, they didn't see the iceberg until it was about 1,000 feet.
Yep.
So you're the and Jesse, I got your text message. Jesse needs to go handle something real quick. I'm going to make this final point before I pause. Uh, a lot of you that live in the city will understand what I'm saying with this. You look up at the nighttime sky, you can't see constellations. Now apply that to the guys out in the lookout. You got these bright lights. That's going to create light pollution too. It may have been even, it probably would have been the 200, 300 yards that would all have been to see the iceberg, which maybe in theory would have saved the Titanic. We'll never know. But as long as any of it is, they couldn't afford it even if they wanted to. So anyway, we get further along in the day, about 6 o'clock, and Charles Lighthauler will take over at the bridge for Chief Officer Wild. About an hour and a half later, Harold Bride, the assistant wireless operator, he's doing the accounts for the day, of all the messages that they've sent to and from the ship, because the wireless officers, the Marconi operators, they weren't actually working for the White Star Line. They were hired to be more or less the what would be the modern day. They were the texters. Not everybody had a cell phone. They wrote down a message, they brought it to the attention of the Marconi operators, and they would type the message out to the land, and relay the message, so that they could send mail and so on and so forth from the ship, should something occur. But they're doing the accounts for what they've done that day, and they're starting to get warnings. The Californian sends a warning. There's 3 icebergs right ahead. So Bride takes the telegram to the bridge, but Captain Smith had already left to go eat with the passengers. So he leaves this telegram with another officer, but none of the surviving officers recall seeing this message. So that was another warning that never reached the captain, that never changed the course of the ship. It's just one of those things. About another hour and some change later, Captain Smith checks in with the bridge before he goes to retire to the cabin for the night. His cabin. He's off to bed. And there's nothing of note to him. So at this point in the night, it's moonless. It's clear. The water's flat and calm. There's really no wind. It's a generally nice night, but without the wind, it made spotting icebergs more difficult. They wouldn't create any breaking water at the base of the iceberg at the water level. And the lack of moonlight would also limit the chance of seeing the iceberg, because the moonlight would actually reflect off the white surface of the iceberg, so you could see it a long ways off. But without any of that, they were literally operating in the dark. They were operating on a couple of sets of human eyeballs. It just it just amazes me how unfortunate the Titanic would become in her final hours.
Yeah, and here's an interesting thought. The crow's nest itself is sitting up on the forward mast.
Yeah,
Now they're looking out into a calm, dark ocean, but you also have to remember what's
it's a
behind them and around them is not dark. they have light behind them, so it's also making it a lot more difficult for them to see further off.
Light pollution coming into play. Kind
Yep.
of kicks the thought of headlights in the balls a little bit
Yeah.
more.
And the, the biggest thing that they were looking for were the shadows of the icebergs blocking out the stars in front of them. That was literally, they're looking at a glass calm ocean with
Hmm.
a line where you can start seeing stars, and they're looking for a small little notch in
They're
between
looking for a
stars.
break. They're looking for a break in the stars, except they can't see. They can't see it.
They can't see it.
It's
It's
and
big, but it's not big enough for them to see that far out. And again, this is kind of where, here's the hypothetical coming into play. If they had had binoculars, 10 to 15 seconds could have made all the difference in the world. Um,
perhaps.
just little things that built to where we are. We're in
And
like the
I
closing
wonder.
seconds.
I wonder how things would have played out if they'd have seen that, as you said. Like, I'm gonna play your scenario out. They have binoculars and they see this thing. We'll call it 1,500 to 2,000 meters out, right?
Yep.
Let's say they double the length of time that they see this thing. They've got a minute now, because I think they had like 30 seconds from impact, or from spotting to impact uh, amount of time. So let's call it a minute. I wonder, do they still try to port round? Do they just try to slam on the brakes, or do they try to go another direction? We really, it's another one of those things where we're not, that little thing changes everything, because if they see it, do they react the same way? I feel
So
I feel like it being spotted so close, it was almost a knee jerk reaction. Like, if
I
if
agree.
you're out driving, you see a deer just come out in front of you about 10 feet, you react a lot differently than if you see it a mile off.
Yeah.
Same concept. Do they still do everything the same way? Do they just try to stop and possibly just boop the front of it, as well, to call back to a phrase, or what do they do there? That
Um,
changes the whole narrative.
yeah, and I feel as though if they had had just a little bit more time, the procedures that they went through was they ordered the ship hard to stern, so the engines were thrown into reverse, and quartermaster Higgins, it throws it to port round it. So basically, what they're doing is they're trying to slow down and turn. Here's kind of where it's like, okay, if they saw it too soon, the ship itself, let's take my phone, pretend it's the ship. So they're going to go to turn. Well, the back end of the ship is going to come around. So if they saw it too soon and tried that, they could have slid themselves sideways into the iceberg rather than going around it.
Which, who knows what damage that could have done, because the other thing that's lost in there, they were going 23 knots
Yep.
when they spotted it. They did not hit the iceberg at 23 knots. They would have slowed down some. I would venture a guess 15, maybe 12
Well,
knots.
here's
It,
here's here's
you
the other
know.
thing that comes into play. They were actually speeding for what they should have been doing.
Oh,
If they had,
yes,
again, had they been going, say,
they were
probably
going full speed.
18, had they been going 17 to 18 knots, the slowdown time would have been different.
Yeah,
So again, there,
what I'm saying
yeah,
though is, we don't know exactly how fast they were going on impact, but I dare say it wasn't 23 knots when they hit, and look at the damage done there.
yeah,
Still, it still was enough to sink her. Now, granted, positioning versus makeup of the ship did come into play, but if and I feel comfortable saying, like I said, 12 to 16 knots probably is a safe estimate, I would think. You know, does it does it matter? Or, are they able to stop how much sooner? It like I said, it changes the narrative so much if they have those binoculars and they're effective. I question whether their effectiveness though, because of, as you said, they have the light pollution. They don't have they're just magnifying the darkness at this point. We don't know exactly how much those binoculars would or would not have helped them.
Yeah, and it's a lot of what ifs.
Yeah, like we said, you
Because
can't tell Titanic without delving into speculation at some point, no matter how hard you try.
yeah, because all that we have left now today are what were the eyewitness accounts and the documented records of it from the trial. There's nobody left alive today to tell the story.
Uh-huh. And I mean, it happened over 100 years ago. I mean, what, Melvina Dean was like a few weeks old at this point, and she passed away some years ago, but she was the last surviving member. The last people that could effectively tell the story died out decades ago.
Yeah.
And it's just, the story of the Titanic is so sad but so fascinating all at the same time. It just it's frustrating because like, I find myself, when I look at this story, I don't know, do you do this too? Like, you'll read something and you'll just like want to reach out through the annals of time and nudge somebody in the right direction to change something.
Absolutely.
Like, you just see this little detail that you think might, just.
So I have this
it's a
bad
domino
habit.
effect.
I have this bad habit of watching documentaries before I go to bed, and then depending what medicines I've had to take that night, I will have dreams where I'm in that situation of, oh shit, I'm on the Titanic. What do I do? Do I tell these people, you kind of, there's so many potential like what ifs, like, what if Captain Smith had even got the iceberg warnings at that point?
I feel like that could be the caption of the book. Titanic, what if? Maybe that's what we'll call this.
We chapter 1 is like this long of like the what ifs.
Yeah, it's a Harry Potter book.
And a lot of things, like you said, it was a series of small things that occurred from the moment the moment the keel was laid, and the design for certain decks to be certain ways, that plays into a part. Decisions the day of or the days leading up to, forgetting a key, these are all major things that
insignificant in their moment, but in hindsight, massive. Kind of like an iceberg. At first glance, not so much. You go a little deeper, huge.
So we're at this point where Fred Fleet spots it. He hits the bell. Ding, ding.
Well, we're
ding.
not there yet. We're not there yet.
Well, we're getting there.
We're getting there because there's something else that happens before that. At about 9:40, Marconi operator Phillips receives a fifth and final ice warning. This comes from the Mesaba. Warning of a great number of icebergs just 15 miles ahead. But because the message was not prefixed with MSG, which was the signifier that the message was intended for the captain, he treated it as non-urgent. Let's stop and baffle at that. 15 miles ahead, there's ice. Big ice. Huge field of just, I don't care what ship you're on. I don't care how arrogant you are. Ice is ice.
I'm going to tell the captain.
That is where I wag the finger a little bit, because motherfucker, 15 miles ahead. That's an hour, give or take, depending on the math you want to do. They're doing 26 miles, around an hour, we'll call it. That's not terribly long, but it's not preferenced for the captain. It was non-urgent. It's an hour away. How urgent does it have to be?
Well, you're also looking at somebody who was given this message who's only 24, 25. What kind of dumb decisions did you and I make when we were 24 and 25?
Let's move on.
But you get my point.
I
This is
get your
somebody
point
this is
vividly.
somebody who is not a seasoned seaman, who's not probably spent as much time in the Atlantic Ocean, and receiving these reports probably doesn't seem like a significant thing to this individual because they're unaware of the absolute dangers.
Yeah, they're
Whereas
not seamen. They're wireless operators.
they
They
don't
pass
know.
messages along all day. To add to his defense, there's about a 2-hour window to send passenger telegrams to and from the ship. He was very busy. I get that. That's one of them that just really jumps out at me, that might have been handled a little differently. But
Suppose it had been a 35, 36-year-old person who'd been more experienced, they would have been like, hang on, let's
mhm.
get the message to the captain. And the course of history is now suddenly changed because of a minute decision.
Then a little over an hour later, the Californian, who's a couple hours away from the Titanic, sends a message to say that she stopped sailing for the evening due to the ice. But Phillips, who is trying to complete all of his work, just gets pissed. It says, "Shut up! I'm busy. I'm working Cape Race." You know, he doesn't know that there's an iceberg just 15 miles ahead, and they're still going about 21 and a half knots at this point. So at about 11:30, the iceberg will be 4 miles and 10 minutes ahead. Now, Frederick Fleet and Reginald Lee would go to the crow's nest at about 10 p.m. And again, they're looking out for growlers more than large icebergs. Murdoch takes over in the bridge from Whitehall. Now here's where the party starts. At 11:39, the iceberg is about 1,000 yards ahead. But again, moonless conditions means the lookouts can't see it still. About 30 seconds later, they see it though, and of course you get the infamous iceberg right ahead, but it's already too late to avoid a collision. They're in the killing zone at this point. The iceberg is unavoidable, and again, you get a you get a call, and I don't know exactly. Naturally, James Cameron's movie, iceberg right ahead. I don't know necessarily if that is how the message would have been relayed.
According to the documents, he picks up the phone, calls the bridge. Yes, sir. What do you see? Iceberg right ahead. Very good, sir. Thank you.
Yes,
That
it's
that it is not an urgent panic. We're in trouble.
and that kind of harkens back to our other special. We talked about it in Mission Control. The operators there don't panic necessarily. They keep it calm. They stay level headed, and they try to solve the problem here. Very similar to what we will see here at Titanic, but unfortunately, in this instance, the Titanic doesn't make it out alive. It hits the iceberg, and they try, and we talked about it. I'm going to try to use a glass here as a reference. You got your iceberg here. They try to go to port, which would be, for those of us that don't know nautical terms, that's their left hand. Left, they turn left. And what they're trying to do is port round it. So they take a left and try to steer it around and swing the butt around and try to pivot. Unfortunately, due to the speed that they were going, the amount of time that they had to react, and Titanic didn't exactly turn on a dime in and of itself, but they had to do something. And again, I say it's like seeing a deer 10 feet in front of you versus a deer a mile in front of you. You react differently. I kind of think it was a bit of a knee jerk reaction because, as you and I both kind of agree, hitting it head on probably saves the ship. I think it saves the ship, critically damages it, of course, but the watertight bulkheads definitely would have a bigger impact here, because the front bulkhead towards the bow of the ship was not lowered by Ismay like the ones further back. It still went all the way up. So it has more of a chance of stopping water from continuing its progression. And I don't know how much damage Titanic would have taken to its nose had it hit head on. I'd like to think that bulkhead would not have been damaged, but it's possible that the bulkhead would have possibly been hit too, though. We don't know. But I would like to think that the Titanic would have survived if it had hit head on.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. And like I mentioned earlier, the way the ship was designed, the bow is like a sharp point. Um, I feel it would have been like an axe blade. It could have just hit right into the ice. Now, yes, there would have been significant damage, and you are correct. The first three watertight compartments go up to a certain point because they're not in the what you would say like the staterooms or the more luxurious parts of the ship were. These were more for like the mail room and storage and crew quarters and things of that nature. So yes, the watertight bulkheads would have played a much more significant role if maybe the front of the ship was damaged.
The other thing we have to take in mind, we talked again about it wasn't that they used bad material. They didn't use best material all the way around the ship. They anticipated that any damage to the Titanic would be in a head-on collision. So the front of the ship is
a lot more.
yeah, it's there's more thought put into how much armor this thing has on the front, on the wedge, than the body itself. And as you go back, we're going to use class for example. What the front's first class all the way, but along the hull you start to get in the second class, and the second class was definitely not strong enough to withstand the pressure of just impacting of just pushing up against the iceberg. And when that happened, you got rivets. The plates overlap and they punch a rivet through. The rivets had a weakness in the head due to all the slag that was in it, the material they used. So it popped. And the description of the leaking inside the engine room, the boiler room, coincides with a split seam as opposed to a giant hole just being torn into the ship. Like the immediate thought was in the aftermath of the sinking is they thought that a giant hole was just punched in the side, and that's what caused it to sink. But forensic analysis says that just burst seams, leaky seams, there's not a seal anymore, and you've got trillions of pounds of seawater pushing in on the wall. She was cut open. She was it was almost like a scrape, but the scrape was done just right, in just the amount, in just the right spot, that it was all it took to topple the giant.
Yeah.
And it's amazing. Just a little
Yeah,
pebble.
it's and it you got to think of the kinetic energy. The 46, or was it
Yeah,
46,000 ton
46,000 tons.
is moving at a high rate of speed towards something that is several 100,000 tons. The kinetic energy,
500,000. Yeah, half
the
a million
kinetic
or something.
energy is it's ice, but that's enough force to move something. And even if it was just a scraping blow, it sheared the heads off the rivets. So
Yep.
once that support, the plate itself is going to shift and that water is just going to seep right in. Water is an amazing property that it will fight to get into a place that it's not.
It gives life, but it's perfectly content taking it too. Um, the the water, it got in there in a hurry, and brother, it did its damage. But the thing is that the most of the passengers barely even felt the collision. That's the thing, is a lot of them slept through it.
Yeah.
It's not a, you know, most of it was
Just a very gentle.
yeah, it'd be no different than you stepped on a rock, a little pebble in the hallway. and kept going. That was literally how insignificant the shaking was to some of the passengers in the finer parts of the ship. But
Yeah,
go ahead.
and there were some passengers that were above deck enjoying the peaceful evening, strolling along, and saw the iceberg hit the ship, and we're like, oh well, that's just well, that's interesting. Not like, oh dear God, we're in danger. It's like, oh well, that's an interesting sight, and going about their stroll because they didn't
Yeah,
put
some
the
of them
thought
didn't even think the ship had even been
hit it.
damaged,
Yeah,
let alone hit. And
yeah,
it's just amazing.
and unbeknownst to them,
So
five watertight compartments were already breached, with the sixth one uh taking on water.
yeah, she could survive 4, not 5. So again, this is where the lowering of the bulkheads come into play, because as the ship takes on water, it, as the ship takes on water, she's going down by the nose. So it tips, the water just spills over into the next, pulling the Titanic down into the water, pulling it, trying to pull it down by the head. And again, if those watertight compartments had not been lowered, the ceiling had not been lowered, they lowered them 10 feet. That's 10 feet per section. Think about the amount of time that the Titanic could have been. You're talking potentially hours that the Titanic might have had to stay afloat. They didn't have enough lifeboats. There's no getting around that. But it stands to reason that if the Titanic had a couple of more hours, you're not looking at the same amount of loss of life by any stretch of the imagination that you would. I'm not saying people wouldn't have died. I'm saying that instead of 1,500, you're looking at maybe 100, maybe more.
No, I would venture to say it would be closer to the 700 to 800 range, only
Well,
because of
it depends on
oh,
how long this thing's staying afloat too, because it sinks it goes under at 220, and then by about 4 a.m. the Carpathia is on scene.
yeah,
So if
but
it gets a couple of hours, potentially speaking, if it stays afloat until 4 o'clock, I don't think you're looking at thousands of people dead.
well, here's the unfortunate problem. Even if they got there just not long after the ship had sunk, people were in the ice cold water. And after about 20 minutes, it wouldn't have made a difference because people were dying from exposure and being in the cold water. That's kind of where I say, like, if the ship itself was still afloat in any capacity when the Carpathia had showed up, yes, the loss of life would have been very, very.
And I believe if it had those 2 hours that those watertight bulkheads would have provided, that's why I'm saying they would not have been in the water for nearly that amount
Nearly
of
as long.
time. Because you're going to get anywhere from 15 minutes to 45 minutes before hypothermia kicks in and kills you. If the Carpathia is on scene, the Titanic is still afloat at 4 o'clock, you're
You know,
talking you're talking a whole different ball game. Now,
yeah.
if the Titanic only gets an hour, yeah, they're still dead. They're still dead. They're not surviving more. I'm gonna split the difference and call it a half hour. You're not surviving a half hour in sub-freezing water, wearing nothing but, for a lot of it was their pajamas,
Yeah.
maybe some formal wear, which I don't know if anybody's ever stood outside in formal wear in the middle of winter. That's not a lot of insulation. Now you're
No.
talking water, which is not shy about where it creeps in. But I stand firm on my belief that if those bulkheads had stayed in their original spots, it is possible the Titanic doesn't even sink. It's possible.
I believe the ship itself would have sunk, but I do agree that it would have taken much longer. And here's another thing that could have played into um
Now,
the ship surviving or not
let me
surviving.
punch a hole in my theory though, real quick. Let's say they have those bulkheads rack where they're at. is there an urgency for other ships to get to them? Are they sending out the distress call as quickly? They are told, Captain Smith is told pretty quick that this ship is got an hour, maybe a little more, pretty quickly after the collision.
Yeah.
She's almost doomed immediately because of the speed the water's going in versus the amount of time it took to close the bulkheads. By that time, they were already well past 4. So let's say that the bulkheads aren't lowered and they're back up there. There's not the urgency. They may underestimate how much time they have, or overestimate how much time they have.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
I had to punch holes in my own theory.
Yeah, and the thing is, here's another thing that could have played into extending the life of the ship at least 45 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, which in the original estimation is the ship has about an hour to stay afloat. The reason why the ship took close to 2.5 hours to sink was that they turned on the bilge pumps. The problem with turning on the bilge pumps were they were in the back of the ship. They were not in the front of the ship. So, in order to get the hoses from the back of the ship to the front of the ship, several officers had to crank the watertight doors open one by one, taking absolute time to get to the flooding. Once they get
Time
to the flooding,
being paramount here. That is at a premium here.
and we're not talking like, oh, this is a quick, oh, we got the door up. It is they are cranking these large handles to move these giant doors that are automatic. So they get to the flooded um, boiler rooms and they begin the process of draining. Guess what? They actually empty, I believe, 1.5 of the boiler rooms of the water. Here's where
That's big.
that's significant. Here's where a problem lies in. The coal bunkers were the ones that were ruptured. So, unbeknownst to them, they've got the water out of the boiler room, but the coal bunkers on the port or on the starboard side are now filling with water to the point where they rupture and the water comes rushing back in. So, I believe that them attempting to pump the water out of the ship kind of bought them maybe an hour. I feel like it bought them maybe an hour and a half of time,
Oh yeah.
which was precious time. Now, keep in mind, they just opened all of the watertight doors. So,
what does that do?
what does that do? Well, here's the interesting thing. There's a failsafe that was put into the watertight bulkheads, and it's called a float plate. As soon as water hits a certain point, no matter what, if it hits that float plate, it will activate the doors automatically and close them. And there's nothing you can do to open them. You cannot override it. So, yeah, there was some time bought, but then there was time lost once that water got through some of the bulkheads. So it's another one of those. What would have happened had there been pumps towards the forward of the ship? The amount of time it would have taken to get those pumps started would have been a lot quicker. They could have potentially gotten a little bit more water out before it became a fruitless effort. So I feel like there's the potential that they could have bought maybe another hour. So
Potentially.
the ship doesn't sink for another 3 hours.
Which plays into my theory of you have the bulkheads up there. Now you've dropped those bulkheads, they're at the proper height, and then you've also got the bilge pumps. It is even more conceivable that thing stays afloat until sunrise, maybe longer.
And
But
and
again, do the ships come as quickly if that ship is not deemed lost?
well, so here's where it comes into an interesting where we
It's
get
a
into that interest.
strange case of what if.
Yep.
Titanic,
So
what if?
we're now at the point where water's coming into the ship and they're telling, hey, we need to start get the SOS out. Or
Mm-hmm.
at that point, CQD,
Yeah.
come ships in
So
distress, come quick, something like that. The Californian is only 10 miles away. They can
and
see the Californian from the Titanic.
They can, but the Californian has no clue that anything has gone wrong, because at midnight, the Californian had turned off her wireless for the evening after getting Phillips's shut up response after the, telling them, hey, 15 miles ahead. So yeah, they were only 20 miles away. Only 20 miles away.
10.
Well, at midnight, they were 20 miles away. And
No, they were not 20 miles away. They were 10 miles away.
according to the research I have here, at midnight, they were 20 miles away and could have reached the Titanic. Earlier on, they might have been, because they were heading a different way.
Well, I'm going off of the stuff that I had, because the reports from the Californian was that they saw the distress flares, but paid no attention to them because they were not red, which meant the ship was in danger.
Right. But again, I think we're talking about two entirely separate points in the timeline, though.
We may be,
because I'm still at 12 a.m. and I think you're further about the 1 a.m. mark. The
Californian was a lot closer when the ship itself
it was
sinking.
it was closer, but there was a point where it was only 20 miles away. And it might have gotten closer. Moving on, however.
You do that. I will try to do a quick double check on that.
At 12:20, Captain Smith gives the order to start loading the lifeboats, because he's been told, the ship's only got an hour. And he kind of already knows that this is not going to end well. He's in fact probably been told already that there's not enough lifeboats, which we should probably touch on that. Before the Titanic even set sail out of its port of call, they had to be given the okay, final inspection by the Board of Inspection, and they deemed that the 16 boats that the lifeboat had, or that the Titanic had, was enough. Keep in mind, that's enough for maybe 1,000 people at most. And obviously, we know that the Titanic does not send out the boats in full across the board. Some barely even have half full. But they actually, the original plan was to have, I want to say, like 48 lifeboats on board. But again, it was deemed that passengers did not pay money to see lifeboats, especially on a ship that is unsinkable. So again, something that seems insignificant at the time rears its ugly head much too late in the process. The first lifeboat is launched at about 12:45, and she's only got 28 of a possible 65 people on board. And the first of 8 emergency distress rockets are fired at about that time as well. That's about a 1:45. And as time progresses, she starts going in little by little, nose first, and she starts tilting downwards. And the amount of stress that ship took on is amazing. Think of it as, we've all done it in our lives as a kid. Take a ruler, you put it on the edge of your desk, and you'll try to do the little balancing thing on the edge, and what'll happen? You put too much stress on the back end, what happens?
It'll break.
And we'll get to that, but more or less, that's exactly what happened, because the Titanic has a double bottom, but that's not enough to support the thousands upon thousands of tonnage that's just hanging unsupported in the air, about that angle, about a 45-degree angle, a little less, I think. But
it was a lot less.
Yeah, it was a lot. I want to say somewhere in like the 20s, maybe 30s.
We're talking like 22, 23 degrees.
Yeah, she's up in the air, and that's a lot of butt in the air. And as the water, because again, she's filling up like this, and it's got that at pivot point. So what's it doing? So
Well, not only that, the ship has two expansion joints, which are at the small little gaps that are already starting to get
yeah,
stretched.
she's under an amazing amount of pressure at this point, and we'll never have full uh a full read on what precisely happened that night, but the historical accounts are terrifying in and of themselves, and I'm sure they don't capture the whole picture in terms of the mood that night. But I'll tell you what, put yourself in that position. You are on that ship. You find yourself in a position where you are not one of the fortunate ones that get into the lifeboat. I can't begin to imagine that feeling that would take over you. You're on a boat where the facade has been broken. The ship is going to sink. It is not unsinkable. And you are thousands of miles away from any land. What do you do? And oh, by the way, that stuff you're sinking into will kill you. You don't have to be a doctor to know that. It's freezing water. What, I can't even begin to imagine the the mood that night, because it's just, again, it's such a tragedy. I just, it's baffling. And you get the historical accounts. You got the band playing, and they're playing "Nearer, My God, to Thee," and all of that. They're going down playing music. So like, what possesses a human being to just go, you know what, in my last moments, I'm going to play music for people. That the stories that come out of Titanic, of the last moment, of the things that happened in the last moment, just across the board, it is so baffling. You know,
Well, it's human nature. It's telling the story of how various humans handled their tragedy. Some people, like the band, were trying to do their best to keep people calm and keep the spirits uplifted. Even they knew it was the end, and then you've got people who are scrambling for their life, and then there's also some people that found a place to sit down because they perfectly calm accepted their fate. So it, it is a very interesting thing to think of. The first hour or so where you're trying to figure out what's going on, and in the final hour where you know what's going on, and it's it's hard to kind of put your mind in that place, because there's
it's
nothing that we ourselves have experienced, at least you and I have, that even come close to that situation. So I guess it's one of those things. It's hard to think about what you would do in those situations.
yeah. And again, you've got, from collision to sinking. They collide ship time at 11:40, and by 12:20 she's gone.
220.
Or I'm sorry, 2:20. Forgive me. It's been a long day at work. It doesn't seem like a lot of time, but for them, it's probably felt like a lifetime
Yeah.
of just of a horror. But at about 12:25, the Carpathia says she's on her way. They're heading for the Titanic. Here's the problem: she's 58 miles away. 4 hours. They've got 4 hours before any help arrives. And at midnight, Captain Smith has already been told, yo, you got an hour, maybe some change. So he can do the math in his head. No help is coming in a reasonable amount of time that's going to fix this situation before anything terrible happens. Unfortunately, they're on their own, and as we know, they don't make it. The Titanic will sink below the water at 1220. Um, it's always fascinated me the amount of fighting amongst historians about whether or not she broke apart up top or below the water, or whether the first one was, did she remain intact going the whole way down, which obviously they found out in 1985 that she'd broken apart. But
Uh,
it's
I
just
was, oh, go ahead.
it's just fascinated me the amount of stuff that people will fight about on this. Doesn't really matter. This
No.
it's
Uh,
sunk. It's
well,
sunk.
it was such an interesting topic that just a few years prior to the discovery of Titanic, there was a movie called Raise the Titanic, where they believed the ship itself was in one piece and that they could raise it from the bottom.
Boy,
Uh,
did that not age well.
that movie really did not age well. Uh, but up until Robert Ballard discovered Titanic in '85, people were not 100% sure if the ship was in two pieces or not.
She does break up, and the bow section goes down intact, kind of about like that, leveling off towards the bottom and coming to a soft landing, if you want to
Basic,
call that. As soft a
basically,
landing as 26,000 tons of iron, plummeting towards the ocean floor can land, you know. But
yeah.
the stern, however, is a different story, and we'll get to that. You were saying, Jesse?
Yeah, so basically, once the ship itself has split apart and the bow has separated, it's full of water. So it is going to cut through the water very, very quickly. I believe they said it sank at a speed of about 35 miles an hour, which took it about 10
I've
to 12.
I've heard five. Or I'm sorry,
Uh,
I'm 10. 10. You're right. 10.
yeah, I've
Thinking
heard
of
10.
something else.
Because it took about, I think they said about 20 minutes for its between 15 to 20 minutes for the bow to reach the bottom of the ocean. And because of the way that it was shaped and the way that it was going down, it's believed that it would kind of break and float kind of like this, eventually to where it would hit the bottom.
Yeah,
And
she lands. I'm trying to. She kind of lands like that,
the pressure was enough to blow
and
the forward storage hatch
yeah,
off of the bow, and it would land
because
hundreds of yards away from
yeah,
the
because
ship.
what people don't think about in that, because a lot of people don't think about what happens to the Titanic when it once it sinks, it just sinks. But you've got 20,000 tons of steel, of iron, moving through water and displacing water. Well, the water's circling back down on that ship. So figure enough water, the amount of water akin to 20,000 tons coming down, that is a lot of water pressure. And as you said, it blew the forward hatch completely off, like completely cleaved the heads of the bolts keeping it down, just completely cleaved it. Like
Yep.
it wasn't even there. That is how much pressure is there. Um
And that, with the water
for
coming down on top of it, is probably what collapsed
Oh
a lot
yeah,
of the
absolutely.
force structure,
It
destroyed the bridge, the mast, everything that was left standing.
anybody that's been to like summer camp, they got that giant inflatable pontoon that you jump on and it bounces the. Think of that, but in a much bigger scale. The water comes down onto the pontoon, obviously being the Titanic, comes down on it and just launches that thing. It just sails off, and it's just amazing. Now, for the morbid people out there, what about the people that were inside? Were they alive the whole way down? General consensus is maybe 30 seconds, maybe 30
Yeah.
seconds, and they just gone, because you're talking water pressure, you're talking the implosion on the ship itself, because water is going to push down on the Titanic, and in the pressure you're talking there, you're talking in the tons per square inch.
Yeah. I think there was no way there were any pockets of air left in the
In
bow.
the
The
yeah, not in
bow
the bow.
the bow was full of water. It's the stern that everybody was curious, like, well, there were people still trapped inside, right? Well,
Possibly.
yes, yes, there
Probably.
were.
Well, probably, definitely.
Um,
Because the bodies that went into the water, they only found a fraction of those of the people. They didn't find everybody that was
yeah.
lost. And
So
math
so we'll
says
definitely talk about. So the stern has now broken off and has basically sort of righted itself into the water. Well, it's going to take just a little bit of time for that water to start filling into what's left of the stern. Here's the thing, the bow had a ample amount of time to level itself with water. The stern is now getting pulled when it's still got air inside of it. And this is
it's
why
buoyancy.
it's buoyancy. This is why the stern stayed afloat for I think they said it was another 3 to 4 minutes,
It wasn't long, about 5, give or take.
a very short amount of time
Yeah.
before, the
It
forces of
was it was long enough to give people the false sense of hope that maybe it was going to stay afloat, but not long enough for them to have that feeling for long.
yes. So once the stern itself starts getting pulled down, because there's also the theory that there was two pieces of hull section that connected the stern and the bow, and it pulled the stern
Yeah.
forward. Um, had maybe the pieces broke off, the stern could have floated itself for a little while, but it's generally believed that the bow pulled what was left of the stern down. Um,
Which we've have since found, obviously, that the math just does not really support that. The
yeah,
steel is not nearly strong enough to support that kind of pressure. Now, if it was, the damn thing wouldn't have sunk, because it would have never fractured in the first place at the seams. But yeah, she levels off, fills with water, and then she kind of she kind of lifts,
rolls.
rolls, and down she goes. And she has a much rougher ride down
It-
to the ocean floor. The aftermath, when they found her, they said it looked like a bomb went off. Several
Yep.
bombs went off,
Um,
but she went, as the bow went down,
Streamlined.
generally very streamlined, very gracefully. This thing, you
The
would have thought it
stern.
was in a tornado.
So basically, the consensus there is once it started going down, there were still major pockets of air inside of it. Well, once you get below a certain depth, well, that pressure is going to just it's going to cause things to start imploding. And as the stern was coming down, it was imploding and imploding, and pieces are ripping off. And where the tear
It tore the
was
deck off. It tore
it
the whole
was
deck off.
it wasn't even a clean break. There were jagged edges, so they were being caught with the water, and the forces being exuded onto the stern to peel steel back to destroy the deck. It just is terrifying, the amount of force. And this is why the whole, oh, well, did some people survive? Probably for about 10-15 seconds, and
If
then
that, yeah,
it would have been over very quickly.
the pressure would have, I think, obliterated them. I don't even,
Yeah.
I don't even think it's a case that their life was crushed out. I think that they were
Yeah,
just
it would have been
exploded.
it would have been instantaneous. They wouldn't have known it. Um,
Probably, depending on who you ask, probably the most merciful thing of the whole entire experience is, you just go out, because that ride down ain't gonna get any better.
and then here's another thing where people don't want to correlate, real life distances. The depth the Titanic sits at is just 2 miles
It's
underwater.
just it's just 2 miles. You can walk that in about a half hour, right?
You can watch an airplane fly over at 2 miles above your head, and you can clearly see this airplane. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Titanic is only 2 miles underwater, and it
Do I
has
have
gone.
one? I
It's
had
gone.
a Yeah.
Oh,
No, I was taught an analogy one time. Like, the metal encasing of the eraser at the end of a pencil.
hmm
If you take that part out off the pencil and lay it down at your feet and stand. If water was crystal clear, just crystal clear, you can see all the way down to the very bottom of the ocean where the Titanic is. That's how big the Titanic would be from your eyesight to your feet. That is from standing at ocean level looking down to the Titanic. That is how far it is. Now
Yeah.
magnify that to real life size.
Yeah. Like the Titanic is not 10, 12 miles under the water. It's only 2 miles under. But the amount of pressure that yeah, that the ship went through getting to the bottom is just
Dog, at 6 feet, you start to feel pressure on your ears when you go underwater at 6 feet, and a lot of people can't handle that. Now
20
you're
feet.
going now, yeah. Now you're going down to 2.5 miles, where even if you could withstand the temperature, you would not withstand the pressure down there. That pressure is enough to kill anything within, like, I'm wanting to say, like a microsecond. You're dead before you even realize you had an accident.
Yep.
The
Uh,
pressure is so awful down there. It's a wonder the
uh,
thing's still standing. It really
uh,
is.
there's a
It,
cool little
not for long, but
there's a cool experiment that they've always done is they'll take a styrofoam cup and they'll place it on the outside of a submersible when they go down to the Titanic, and when they come back it is the size of a thimble. That's
that's scary science. That's the science that you don't get to learn about in science class. This is the real thing. This isn't just in a book. This is
it is
documented.
it is actually safer to go into space than it is to dive into the ocean, because in certain circumstances if you were to tear your suit in space,
Oh
um,
God.
it is not an instantaneous death. There's the potential that you could be saved and recovered, whereas in the ocean, mm-mm, you do not have that luxury, and it's scary.
It's awful. Um so of the we're gonna go into the statistics here. About 68% of the people on board died. There were a little over 2,200 people on board. 710 total were saved. 1,500 were lost.
Yep.
So yeah, almost a 7 out of 10 died. 3 out of 10 survived.
That's that's
You had a 30% chance, and that's taking all classes into account. All classes, just general. Just taking classes out of the equation, 3 out of 10 will survive.
yeah, I remember seeing a chart showing the statistics of the amount of first class that survived,
Oh,
the
it's
amount of second
it's
class. It's there were more third class that were lost than anything else, surprisingly.
mm-hmm.
And a lot of that has to do with where they were on the ship. They were in the lower parts of the ship. So once the ship was sinking, they didn't know how to get out.
And for a lot of them, by the time they even got up to the deck, boats were already gone, because again, they only had 16 lifeboats.
Yeah.
Only had 16. Only
Well,
had
6,
16.
16
And a couple
standard
of submersible or
collapsible,
collapsibles
4 collapsibles, only 2 of which were able
made.
to be
Yeah.
properly. So
So
it-
your odds just were not great on that fateful night. Um, we're gonna jump ahead a little bit. The Titanic uh would lay undiscovered until September 1, when Robert Ballard would find her. He was actually doing something else at the time we won't get into, but he got to find the Titanic. And it's just amazing how things just kind of played out, that we didn't have the technology to get down there until what, about 80 years late, almost 80 years later.
Roundabout, yeah.
roundabout. So even there, you're finding a crime scene that's almost 80 years old by the time, 70 years old by the time you get there. But I do want to touch on the investigations that would happen. It was deemed that while speeding through an area that was known to have ice was irresponsible, it was deemed that no wrongdoing really occurred.
No, because there were certain standards at the time that were accepted. The ship sailing as fast as it was, well, in open water, that was acceptable. The ice warnings, uh, it was not prudent to them because they were going to change course and go where they believed the ice wasn't. So, I comical errors, things that were not maliciously done, they just happened to be happenstance.
Yeah.
Um, Something they should have done, but it was canceled, was the lifeboat drill. The day of the accident was, or there were supposed to have been lifeboat drills. Um, just simple things like that, where
And
you know,
think about that
little.
for a second. No rehearsal. Going into a disaster, a critical disaster like that, and they're able to get 18 of the 20 usable lifeboats out into the water. 18. Not a lot went right that night, but I would say that that is admirable at the very least, that they were able to coherently at least get the boats off. Now, yes, they did not have all of them filled to capacity. You can take what you will out of the women and children first. Uh, it's just it's amazing to me that they were still able to get it to get to that point, because it's very feasible given that they had no rehearsal. Maybe half those boats get out to the water. It's very possible. It just speaks to the experience of the crew that was on that ship too. I think that really came into play, is these were not Johnny come latelys that just happened to be on the most grand ship that ever sailed. These were experienced seamen that knew their stuff, and I think that definitely saved some lives that night.
Yeah, and there were a lot of instructions being yelled to them uh, while all this is going on. Well, the
Thousands of
ship.
people screaming and talking and yelling.
Well, not only that, the ship is venting its steam,
Yeah, I
so
was
it
about
is
to
a
say that.
very loud. It's impossible to hear, and these guys are still able to perform.
And
It's
performed well.
incredible.
They performed well. In fact, I believe they were British, as the line was, as Captain's been said, "Be British, boys," and
Yeah.
and they performed admirably. One character whose actions are called into question a lot would be our boy Mr. Ismay. He jumps into a lifeboat. He is the owner of the ship. He is one of the most prominent people there. And he jumps into a lifeboat, and he would live to regret that for the rest of his life. By most accounts, he
Yep.
he he was he was made the poster child for this in the aftermath of things that went wrong. He was kind of made the villain in this story, and I think that he made a lot of decisions that lent itself to the problems that night, and not just that night, but the entire voyage, what would come. I think it is unfair to hang it all on him, because he's not the one that didn't transport the messages to the captain about the ice being close ahead. He is not the one that decided to go that fast. That falls on the captain. The captain's decision out on out on water is beyond contestation. Nobody is telling the captain to do anything. The captain is the one saying. Bruce Ismay is definitely going to hold his fair weight of blame, but I think it is unfair to lay it all at his feet.
No,
I don't think that any one person is to blame for the sinking of the Titanic. I think it
no,
was very much a group project.
it was very much not only a group project, but it was, like I said, a comedy of errors where
Yeah,
things that you just inconceivable minute things are what really led to what happened. And it's not like this was a gross negligence type of thing. It was, for the time, it was just accepted.
yeah. I think that's probably the one of the things that will always stick out to me is that for all of the comedy of errors, this guy, and I think a lot of it is simply because he didn't go down with the ship. The captain
Yeah,
certainly did. I don't. While I think the honorable thing would have been to go down with the ship, I don't think he was obligated in any way, because at a certain
no,
point, it's every man for themselves.
it is. And in another light, it is actually very important that he survived because, well,
Yeah,
it made things a lot easier to be, for the court, essentially, for the
yeah,
hearing.
for all the hearings and findings, because he was grilled hard because the British had their inquiry and then the Americans had theirs, and he was the star witness in
But
both.
look at it this way: had he not survived,
You've
would the
lost the
trial
captain, you've lost the president, you've lost several officers.
would the trial have been as hard on an individual as they would have been on him?
Oh God, no. He and again, it was kind of the court of public opinion because he did not go down with the ship. Now they've got a very convenient coward and therefore a bad guy.
Yep.
And again, I think it's unfair to lay all of the blame at his feet. He did not have a role in a lot of things that would end up costing lives on the Titanic, but he did have a role in a few things that cost
Yeah.
a lot of lives on the Titanic. Um, in the aftermath, though, of Titanic, it's very sad in history. You see this in human history a lot. You don't really see a change until after something bad happens. You never see the stoplight put in at the crosswalk until after someone's run over. And Titanic was no different. A lot of changes to the way that the radio operators would come from this. The iceberg, the international iceberg control patrol would become a thing. A lot of your, and of course, enough lifeboats for everybody on board became a standard. Because, as I said earlier, sailing at that point was very much the old man's club. Ships had quadrupled in size since the handbook for how to do things on a ship in terms of safety and protocol. Uh, the statistics that they were using were proper for a boat a quarter of the size of the Titanic. Now, but on a Titanic, you can understand where the math definitely falls apart when you take something that's a couple 100 feet large and then you blow it up. That percentage does not work for that size. So in the aftermath, naturally, now you have to have lifeboats for everybody. They passed the Radio Act of 1912, which stated that radio communications on passenger ships must be operated 24 hours a day. A lot of these ships turn their radios off, like the Californian, because they were either shutting down for the night or other reasons, what have you. So you've got that. A lot of things came from the Titanic that it's awful that the Titanic sunk. I don't think anybody would wish that it had. But a lot of good inevitably did come from the sinking of the Titanic because it forced the game to change for seagoing vessels.
Yeah. And the annals of history are written with this exact same thing, where things go as they are until an accident or a tragedy occurs, and then there's a redesign, there is safety implemented, and then there's changes for the better. And you know, something else, had Titanic not happened, something else would have come along and probably prompted the change. Would it have been as well known? No, I don't think so. The
Oh
reason
no,
why the
we don't
reason
talk
why
about Titanic if it doesn't sink.
we don't talk about Titanic if it doesn't sink. The reason why Titanic was such a prominent thing was because it was a celebrity. It was well known. If this had happened to a battleship, or if this had happened to some other passenger steamer, it would have not gotten the mainstream attention.
Yeah, if Joe Snuffy walks across the street and gets hit, you might get a blurb on your local news. If Kim Kardashian walks across the street and gets hit, we're talking about that for a month on every channel in the world.
Yeah.
And that's really what happened here.
And we can equate the same thing to NASA. Uh, Apollo
If
1. If
yeah,
3 astronauts were not killed, we would have not got to the moon.
if
Simple
if
enough.
if nothing had happened to Apollo 13, if it was a successful landing, we don't do a special.
It's a terrible way to look at that.
It's terrible, but it's true, and history shows us that.
And
It's
we would have not had moon landings past, probably Apollo 15. We wouldn't have had the last couple of landings. So,
no, and this is another prime example. It took disaster to get human interest, and it took disaster to get change. And if nothing else, I suppose that change, no matter when it comes, if it means saving lives, then God bless when it happens. Unfortunately, in this instance, it took the loss of some 1,500 souls in order for the proper changes to be made. And now, of course, nowadays, you've got all sorts of technology, and I couldn't even begin to fathom all the stuff that's on there, but I can guess pretty strongly that the lives of the crew on any given boat in the water right now is not dependent on the two sets of eyes in a crow's nest some 75 feet in the air
yeah.
anymore. No.
And I remember being told by somebody at some point in my life that complacency is a terrible thing. That once you become comfortable, that's when mistakes are made. That's when
Oh
accidents
yeah.
happen. And this was a thing. This was a complacency. We have sailed the ocean on these ocean liners. We know what we're going to do. We know how we're going to handle things. And then surprise, something you've not thought about suddenly happens, and now you're in this life or death situation. It's just, like I said,
It's baffling. Yeah.
it's baffling, it's interesting, it's fascinating, it's terrifying. And like I said, we're looking at an event at this exact point in time was over 112 years ago.
It'll be 111
Okay.
this year.
So 111 years ago, that's 11 decades, of time that has where people have learned and adapted. And e- what sucks is that we're in a day and age where people don't seem to learn from history, and
Those who don't learn from history are doomed to
history
repeat it.
are condemned to repeat it. Yep.
I've
Yep.
often felt that if you have a proper grasp on history, you can predict the future. You have a,
100%.
and this is just one of those things where, again, you hate to apply 2021 when we're recording this. It's 2021. You hate to apply 2021 ideals to an instance that happened in 1912, because the world in 2021 is completely different from the world in 1912. You know,
Yeah.
hell, the Chicago Cubs hadn't even suffered a 100-year drought for the World Series yet. They were just a few seasons shy or past winning a World Series. Just one of those things where it was a completely different world. Just case in point, just a lot of the things that we take for granted in our life, either didn't even exist yet or was still very new. And the Titanic will go down as probably one of the uh, greatest, well, not, I don't want to use that term, but for lack of a better term, it's one of the most prominent moments in human history because of everything that went into it and everything that came out of it and the impact that it had in the world. Hell, it spawned multiple movies, one of which probably is one of the most famous movies of our generation. So you can't tell me that the Titanic doesn't hold merit even now. It's it's still just as
Well,
prominent.
when there has been some sort of shipping disaster of a passenger ship, they reference Titanic. Now, this is not as bad as, or this is as worse than the Titanic disaster, which only had da 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 da.
Yeah.
So, like, no matter what, it's always something that will be used as a point of reference, not a measuring stick, so to speak, of, well, this disaster in terms of the Titanic would have been, blah, 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 blah. So
Hmm.
it's there's things that happen in history that can still be applied to modern day,
Absolutely.
as a point of reference. So, it will never, so long as people like you and I and my girlfriend, my friends at Luna Replicas, and the thousands of other people like us that are interested in these things, the history of Titanic will never die, so long
No.
as there's still an interest in it, and it's great to know that.
It's yeah. I when I think of Titanic, it's she. I wish that she hadn't have gone down because I wish I could sail on her. But that being said, if she hadn't sunk down, would you even know about her? So it's kind of one of those things where it's like it's easy to say, but then when you really apply some thought to it, like she'll only
Yeah,
ever be a legend because it was legendary what happened to her.
and I've been fortunate enough to see
Please, I was hoping you would tell this story.
I have been fortunate enough to see a piece of Titanic twice in my life, being close enough to almost touch this giant piece of hull that I believe they said they recover. It was recovered from the wreck, and it was believed to have been from the starboard side, somewhere near the break. And it's just it's an amazing thing to actually look at, that this was the state of the art technology
It's a time
that's
capsule. It really is.
that sat on the bottom of the ocean at the time that I saw it, which was probably the first time I saw it was like I think 2002, 2003, and then I saw it again just a few years ago because it's at the Titanic Museum in Pigeon Forge. You know, it, it's just it's mind blowing, and um, you know, it's one of those things. Like, yeah, if this disaster had not happened, I don't think we would be talking about it.
Oh, absolutely not.
And
And it's
it's
sad.
and we don't talk about the Britannic. We don't talk about the Lusitania. We don't talk about the Carpathia. All of those ships were sunk at some point in time. All of them were sunk in war. I believe the Carpathia actually was sunk in World War II. It was either a mine on mine patrol, or it was carrying troops, but it was torpedoed and sunk.
Yep.
The Lusitania was torpedoed and sunk. The Britannic was torpedoed and sunk. But those were all in acts of war, and they're just another name of a ship on a list of thousands of others.
This
That
one happened. It was very much a peacetime, so to speak. It was just a tragedy.
and the name of this nurse escapes me, but she was the
I know you're
only
talking about.
person to have been on the Olympic when it collided with the Hawk. She survived the sinking of the Titanic, and she survived the sinking of the Britannic. So she was on all three ships
Correct.
on all three of their disasters.
She was a yeah. In fact, on the Britannic, she's like, I've done this before. Follow me. It was one of those things. She was very much a seasoned veteran at this point.
And I believe she went back to serve on the Olympic after the Britannic, and she lived a very long and prosperous life, but she just happened to survive disasters on all three sister ships.
I'm not going on a vacation with her ever. I'm sorry. But that's kind of like the Tom Hanks thing. I don't want to be on a plane with him because bad things tend to happen, apparently.
When
You know,
When Tom Hanks
Hanks
travels,
travels. It's a bad thing.
it's a
But
bad thing.
with that being said, we have tried to bring you guys just our take on the Titanic and everything. Then there's all sorts of stuff that we didn't talk about that just time did not permit.
If I
But
mean, this is just like the Apollo 13. You and I could sit here for probably 4 hours and just talk about theories, what we believe, what we think could have happened. We could talk about the interesting life stories of people on the ship, the Astors, But this was just kind of like a little scoop.
this was an overview, but we highly encourage you to go back and do your own research on not only Apollo 13, but of course the Titanic. They are both treasure troves that you can't just get it in one setting. It's like a buffet, man. You got to keep going back for more, and you'll be amazed what you find. And I have always enjoyed Titanic lore in the documentaries and any books I can get a hold of. I highly recommend you go out there and do your own digging and see what you come up with. Jesse, any parting words for us?
Um, nothing, nothing out of the realm of the ordinary, except as we go into essentially what you and I are going to call our little break, because we're taking a break from the podcast. I have my Tampa stuff. You've got your trip coming up.
Oh, there's no break. We're still putting stuff out.
Well, we're still putting stuff out, but you and I are taking a little time. But this still holds very, very true and very prominent, especially for me going into this upcoming weekend that do not add to the population, do not subtract
Actually,
from the population.
it'd be last weekend.
Well,
At
as
the
we're
time of
recording,
viewing this, it'd be last weekend.
and
Sorry.
I may or may not be the reason why we have a safety briefing on
Do
Monday.
not be the reason that we have a safety briefing when we come back from our hiatus. So with that being said, we hope you enjoyed not only this special, but the Apollo 13 special and all the stuff we've done so far. We will see you in the near futures. So stay tuned. Go back, check out all of our other episodes. And with that being said, this is the crew of Pop Goes the Zebra wishing you all a good night. And we hope that you have a pleasant evening. Take care.